You talk about diving into your shadow side. Talk
Mm,
about that a little bit because I think you're right. It's when we show vulnerability, that's when we're most impactful.
absolutely. I think vulnerability is so much your superpower, and Brene Brown says you either stand outside your story and you own it, or you stay inside your story and you struggle for your worthiness. And
Ooh.
I think it's so important to kind of own your story. And a lot of owning that means owning all of it, the darker shadow parts of yourself too.
Laura Reed grew up with a stutter. It impacted many aspects of her life until one day she saw a sign for a storytelling contest. She jumped on stage, wowed the crowd, and changed her life. She's the author of the Public Speaking Horror Show. It's a terrific must have book for anyone facing public speaking. And for my paying subscribers, there's a special behind the scenes conversation where Laura and I speak about the ins and outs of public speaking on Zoom. You won't want to miss this. Laura, welcome to Bump in the Road. If you would, tell us your story.
Absolutely, Pat. Thank you so much for having me here. Well, when I was a little girl, I thought a monster lived in my throat. Every time I tried to speak or answer even the simplest question, like, what's your name? It felt like the monster woke up and would eat my words. So I grew up with a severe stutter. And even though I went through years of speech therapy to become more fluid with my words, the shame and the humiliation and the just deathly fear that I felt surrounding speaking just stayed with me like well into my adult years. And it wasn't until I'd gone back to work. I was a full-time mom for a couple years after my son was born, and I really needed this job. I was hired as a teacher, and we're sitting in this teacher training, I remember, and they handed out an agenda, and I saw the word that I dreaded most: introductions. For whatever reason, it was just like introducing myself in front of a group of adults was the hardest thing for me. Just saying my name was still so hard. And as I got closer and closer to my turn to speak, I remember noticing everyone else was just introducing themselves with ease. I started having these symptoms like nausea, back pain, and then suddenly I could barely breathe. And I didn't know it then, but I was having a full blown panic attack, like, just from the thought of having to say my name. I got up and I left the room and went in the bathroom. I was having this attack and I went home sick without ever introducing myself. But really, I went home with so much shame and fear that I couldn't even hold down a job, which I needed very much. And this feeling that I was just going to be found out, that I was just not like a real person, really. I was kind of wearing this mask, but deep down, I could barely do like normal things like speaking. And that day, I knew I had to make a change. Like so much depended on that. And shortly after, I happened to be walking down the street and like I saw a sign. In this case, it was just a literal sign. It was a flyer for a storytelling competition. And I don't know if you've ever had those moments where your your brain is like, "No way," like, "Don't do it," but your
Yes,
gut
I have.
says, "Do it." So here's a little public speaking side tip. I would say when it comes to speaking opportunities, like, trust your gut, and I entered that competition, and I found this unlikely place of refuge, on a stage, in front of a microphone, sharing my story. I won that competition, and that really, just inspired me, but not even that, that I had won, but that so many people came up afterwards and were like, they were because of my vulnerability. And I talked about growing up with a stutter and how it was still really with me and held me back. And they were inspired then to share their stories and try to empower their voices as well. And I think what I learned most from that whole experience was that what you fear can set you free. And it was because of that, because of finally running towards my fear, that it launched my whole career as a public speaking coach, because I felt like I was the most scared person of public speaking in the entire world. And I knew that if I had taught myself like so many of the techniques that you're not going to find from Googling overcoming public speaking fear, like I really lived them and developed them on my own. If I could overcome that, I could help so many others learn how to share their stories and um, be more confident speakers.
You talk about diving into your shadow side. Talk
Mm,
about that a little bit because I think you're right. It's when we show vulnerability, that's when we're most impactful.
absolutely. I think vulnerability is so much your superpower, and Brene Brown says you either stand outside your story and you own it, or you stay inside your story and you struggle for your worthiness. And
Ooh.
I think it's so important to kind of own your story. And a lot of owning that means owning all of it, the darker shadow parts of yourself too. And I think when we really get in touch with the part of ourself that we hide from others, for me, it was so much, my stutter. I was ashamed of it. And so that's what I suppressed deep down in me. But that doesn't go away just because you're trying to hide something. It's still there,
But, a
So
stutter had to be really tough because that impacts your whole sense of self-worth as a young person.
it does. And the thing is, a majority of the time as an adult, I was a fluid speaker. But every once in a while, something would come up. Like for me, the perfect storm was that introduction setting. But it also could be like just randomly someone asking me a question out of the blue, that especially if there's only one answer. Like I remember someone asked me if my son Riley was a girl or a boy. When I said, "Oh, I have a child named Riley," and I couldn't say the word boy. And it was so like I was probably in my 30s, I think, at that time, and I was in this writing workshop, and I've been completely fluid that whole time. I'd read my work out loud. No one thought anything, about that I would have a stutter. And then suddenly I couldn't say that word. So I would find that extra embarrassing because it felt like being sort of found out. So as far as like with my shadow self, it really, finally accepting that I still had this monster within me and kind of friending it, and really realizing finally that that's the part of myself, that darker kind of monster within me, that I feared so much for most of my life, was the part that was really powerful, that I wouldn't do what I do today, I wouldn't be who I am today without it. And that changed everything.
What was the bridge that created a friendship for you with your darker side?
Mm. I think stepping onto a stage and for the first time in my life, running towards the thing I had been so
That
scared
is
of
so
for so
gutsy.
long. Yeah, but running towards something, I mean, it's scared until you're really there in the moment doing it. That's what's so interesting about fear sometimes is, it's that dread. For me, dread is really something that hasn't happened yet. So we build it up in our heads with so much fear. But actually, what was amazing to me was when I was on the stage telling my story into that microphone, I felt incredible liberation. And there was like the fear kind of melted away. And especially as you speak more and more, and if you get to ever experience the connection that can happen with an audience, there's no fear there, because it's no longer about you. It's about what you're impacting to that audience. It's kind of a gift you're giving them, and there's so much love there. And I think when there's love, there's no fear.
And there's an energy between a speaker and an audience that develops. And I think that has a life of its own.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're all energy. And I think so much of communication, whether you're on a big stage or you're raising your hand in a PTA meeting or, whatever it is, you're picking up, your telephone to make a hard call. It's all just energy. And I think the energy that we show up with is reflected back to us and reflected onto that audience. So it's the energy is so important to think about and to be intentional about.
And I think sometimes that dread actually are the voices of other people,
Mm,
not our own voices.
yeah.
And we have to recognize that in order to dismantle it.
Yeah, it's so true. I mean, in some ways, your fear, we should all be really grateful for our fears and that feeling of dread because it is definitely directing us towards something that maybe we need to work on within ourselves that we wouldn't know about otherwise. Like when I ask my clients, like, well, what are you really scared of when they say they're freaking out about this speaking opportunity? And so often it might be a fear of judgment, and then that's an inside job. That's something that we need to work on the inside, like what that judgment is really coming from, that fear. Or maybe they're just scared of forgetting their words. And so, okay, well, that's an easy fix. We just need it. Like, let's practice this so much that there's just no way you're going to internalize what you're going to say, and there's no way you're going to forget it.
I know, when I speak, I usually put together a mental outline, and as long as I have that outline, I can talk. It's not a problem.
Mm,
I just have to remember the sequence in the outline, and obviously, I've fleshed it out beforehand, but once I know that opening, um, a sentence or 2, I'm
mm.
rolling.
Yeah, I'm the same. And that opening sentence is so important because, again, that's the energy, that's the hook. That's where you most want to grab your audience and let them know, okay, they want to listen to what you have to say, and you're really enthusiastic and confident about it too. And then working from an outline, I think, is fantastic. To be honest, I write out everything first
I do
because
too. Yep.
I just want that flow. I wanna know what it is I really wanna say and be concise about it and know what stories are really gonna be in there. But then to get to that outline part is so important because if you just stay with the memorization of a script, the minute you forget that next word, when nerves might set in when you're there actually in it, you forget everything. And that's where people kind of blank out, and that's not a good feeling.
Well, I think it's so important to find your voice.
Mm,
And it's not always easy to find your voice. Well, you wrote in your book, which is terrific, by the way, The Public
thank
Speaking
you.
Horror Show, great book. You wrote, after Phyllis died, she realized that I didn't want to be, you realized you didn't want to be on my deathbed, filled with regret about all the words I never spoke.
Mm, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, Phyllis was my stepmother, and, she died some many years ago now, and I had so many wonderful stories to share about her, and I remember sitting there in a church pew, and the pastor had asked, "Would anyone like to come up and share stories about Phyllis?" And I was too scared. I couldn't do it, and I just listened to all these people sharing stories, and I was filled with so much regret from that, and I think that was really not not finding my voice yet, not accepting it, not embracing that monster within me. And, sometimes we put a lot of pressure on ourselves to be like a speaker, like we've heard someone else speak, maybe you heard Tony Robbins or Brene Brown or Oprah or someone you really admire as a speaker, and they're so good, and so you pretend to be like, you want to be like someone else, instead of really embracing what makes your voice unique. And I tell people I work with, it's not a presentation, it's a conversation. We're just having conversations, and we have conversations all the time. And what makes you unique to your friends? Maybe you're funny, or you're just a really good listener, you ask great questions. I mean, those are things to bring to any conversation you're having, whether it's on a stage with an audience or you're just talking to your friend on a couch. That's your voice.
Do you think women have a tough time finding their voice?
That's a really interesting question. In some ways, I think women really have more vulnerability that we can tap into. And I see that as such a strength.
Mhm.
And it's not the loudest voice in the room, I believe, that gets the attention. I think it's the voice that really has something to say. And so I think women make amazing speakers because it's not about being loud. Like I referenced Tony Robbins, like I think of him as like this kind of boisterous voice. It's sometimes it's those softer voices, and I think again just embracing that, and embracing that vulnerability. I think women tend to be very compassionate. I'm very much an introvert, so I as I'm saying this, I think, oh yeah, this is, I think, what also makes introverts great speakers as well, because we tend to be very um, purposeful. We don't like small talk,
Yeah.
and we want our words to count, and we want to have meaningful connections with people, and that can make a great speaker. And I think women have that.
Yeah, I think they have a lot of the ability to create emotional resonance. And that emotional resonance is energy, and it's what really connects us.
Mm,
And I think, I mean, when you feel something or when your audience is feeling what you're saying, oh, you've got them. And I
yeah,
mean that in the best way. You have that give and take of energy, understanding, maybe compassion. It's I think that's what I think that's what one ideally aims for in a talk. What else do you aim for?
absolutely. When you really focus on your audience. I think that's really the first place to look. Who are they? What did they find funny? What are their challenges? What's the theme of maybe the conference you're speaking at, or even if it's in a small networking group, or whatever it is, really thinking about the audience and the message and the stories that would resonate with them is a place to start, because then it's not about you. And I think so much as speakers, we're focused too much kind of looking in the mirror, judging ourselves, criticizing ourselves, usually worried about how we're going to sound and look and say, how our words are going to come out. And I think the important thing is when we turn that mirror around to reflect towards that audience, suddenly it takes a lot of pressure off ourselves. And it's such a benefit then too to the audience, because they're getting more of the energy that is more giving, than us thinking about receiving something, receiving accolades and receiving compliments about what we're saying. It's really not about that. It's always about them. So the first place I would always focus is on them. The question that I love to ask, and this is a model that's in the book, it's out there as a speaking model, to reflect on, is asking yourself, maybe as you're outlining your speech or coming up with a script about what you want to say, is what do I want my audience to think, feel, or do? And if you can answer those questions, you're just in a much better place then to create something that is going to have a much bigger impact on
Mm.
your audience.
Think, feel, or do? Those are
Mhm.
really big questions.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. But in a way, it's simple too. What do you want them to think about? Maybe it's a mindset change, or, think about something in a new way because of your message. And then feel is, usually for me, it's I want them to feel inspired, to share stories. I often speak on the power of storytelling. And then do can be your call to action. I think so often we forget that. And it doesn't have to be like a call to action like buy my thing, right? It could be a call to action just like today I want you to start doing this thing a little differently that is potentially going to change your life.
And I think we change our life in baby steps.
Mm,
You know,
yeah.
I'd love to be able to think that you could burst out on the stage tomorrow and, boom, everything would be different. But I think the reality is to find that inspiration to make gradual change, because that's reality. We always think in binary terms, win, lose, that kind of thing.
Mm.
But the reality is we win through a lot of little wins and losses.
Absolutely. Like I was telling you before, we started recording, I recently spoke at a very big venue, at a big convention in front of, there was thousands of people at this convention, and myself from, I think it was like 15 or 17 years ago, sitting in that sitting in that staff meeting, having a panic attack over the thought of just introducing myself. It wasn't really a big, huge thing, that shifted everything. Although, getting up on the stage with a storytelling competition felt big, but there were a million little baby steps that led to that moment. And I think, the first is just recognizing where you are and then where you really want to be. And the path there, you can never just, jump straight to it, right? There's going to be a lot of twists and turns. And I think sometimes we have one failure or make one mistake, and then we just get completely discouraged about that goal. But I think even what we perceive as failures, it's great to embrace those because, they're teaching us something along the way and will make you so much better when you get to that goal.
Oh, absolutely. I have a daily mantra. It is, what can I learn?
Mm,
And you
I
learn
love that.
from everything, from other people, from yourself, from your reaction to things. And I think that those failures are really important.
Absolutely, absolutely. Those bumps in the road, right?
It
They
really.
just make that journey that much more interesting, right? And meaningful. And, sometimes I think if we're scared about something like what I do, or we're scared of failing, I often just approach it with curiosity. And I encourage the people I work with to do this as well. Just asking yourself, well, I wonder how this is going to go, and just approach things with that childhood kind of wonderment that we tend to lose as we're adults, because no matter how it goes, like, we've learned from it. And I think that's such an important lesson.
Well, I think it's a huge lesson. The Buddhists call it beginner's mind. And no
Mm,
matter how experienced you are or how good you are at something, you can still approach it with beginner's mind.
mm,
And that opens up a whole avenue of curiosity, exploration,
mm,
maybe taking you down rabbit holes you never expected. But I think
mm.
I'm with you. I think curiosity is one of the most vital components of an interesting life.
I love that so much. I love the beginner's mind. Yeah. It's like when I start something, a new project, I've got so much enthusiasm, but sometimes enthusiasm has a shelf life. And I think so we
Sure.
have to just keep at it. Sometimes there is like just hard work that has to go into things. But just keeping with that sense of, wonder and enjoyment of the process, and bringing delight and joy to everything, no matter how dark it might be. I think, bringing that sense of joy, my number one tip for any kind of speaking is to have fun. Because, no matter what it is you're speaking on, there's that element that it can still be fun. And that you get to do this thing, you get to impact people, maybe make them laugh, maybe make them cry. To me, there's a huge element of fun in that.
I totally agree. In your book, you have, a methodology that you use to, address public speaking,
Mm.
scare, in
Mm.
keeping with the horror show storytelling model. Can you talk about that a little bit? Because that was really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really important sometimes to work with different frameworks and methodologies, because it helps keep things kind of concise too. I think, and it was fun, like, using that methodology in the book. It's mostly on storytelling, but I think it's really important to kind of start out, our stories with a bit of a hook to just engage everybody, and the story that I think I use in the book, honestly, I just made it up as I went along, but kind of using a methodology for storytelling and the elements that really need to be in there, right? And so I have a story of just a little boy telling, or that's in a a spelling bee competition, and building up the stakes. So yeah, the essence that's in there, I won't go through the whole thing, but it's just is stakes, because we want our stories that we tell to have a element of, oh my gosh, what's going to happen? What's going to happen next? So, suspense and stakes are, I think, so important to build up in there, and remembering to use stories, as much as we can, to use stories, because that's what people are going to remember, and that's where that connection can really come.
What other advice would you give to people thinking about doing some public speaking?
just start doing it. Like if it's something that you want to do, don't say no to those opportunities that come up. And I think it's important to kind of let yourself off the hook with putting a lot of pressure on yourself, right? You know, what I tell my inner critic if it starts speaking up about, oh my gosh, Laura, you're going to forget your words. You're going to, I don't think you're ready for this, whatever it is that it might be saying to me. I say, no one's going to die, right? I'm just telling the story. Like I'm just speaking on the stage, right? It's not really a big deal in the huge timeline of life. It's going to be okay. So remember, just to have fun and to start, getting in touch with what it is that is your purpose, like your unique why, your message that you want to really share with people that can impact them and start changing lives. And, when I'm looking for speaking opportunities, sometimes I just Google, if I want to, okay, like I'm imagining the audience I want to speak to, maybe, all right, I want to speak to women leaders. And when the first big conferences I ever spoke at, I had just Googled women's leadership conference and it came right up. Women's leadership conference. It was in Bangkok. And that was some years ago. I applied to it. I got a speaking gig. And that was my first international speaking, that I did was that conference in Bangkok, which kind of changed my whole life actually. But you can kind of just keep it easy. And it's amazing what can happen.